When I extended my hand toward him, the room went quiet. His eyes dropped to it, then rose to my face, holding my gaze for only a second before he spoke. "I don't shake hands with employees," he said, his voice calm, loud enough for every ear in that marble conference hall to catch. For a moment, no one breathed. A few nervous chuckles broke the silence, the kind people make when they don't know whether to laugh or run. But he wasn't joking. His attention shifted away like I had ceased to exist. I pulled my hand back slowly, feeling the air between us grow heavy, like something invisible had just cracked. He didn't know it yet, but those 6 words had just rewritten his future. He turned to greet others, flashing that $1,000,000 smile, shaking hands that didn't matter half as much as the one he had refused. But the room had changed. People felt it, an unease spreading in quiet ripples. His assistants fidgeted with their papers. One of them glanced at me, guilt flickering across her face. No one dared to say anything. He still believed he owned the moment. He didn't realize he had just lost it. Her name was Nia Carter. 15 years in corporate deal-making had taught her how to read silence better than most people read language. She had negotiated billion-dollar contracts across continents, energy, banking, telecommunications, even aerospace. She'd been in rooms where arrogance floated heavier than the perfume of money. And she had learned again and again that power doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself when it's tested. She grew up knowing she'd have to earn her space twice, once through skill and once through perception. Being a black woman in global finance meant her competence was never assumed. It had to be proven, daily. Every handshake, every sentence, every glance was a test. But that morning, Nia wasn't here to prove anything. She was here to close a deal worth $10 billion, a merger that would reshape 2 industries and change how entire markets operated. Her company had spent months crafting the perfect agreement, spotless reports, airtight projections, and forecasts that left no room for uncertainty. The final step was simple: signatures. One handshake, one photo, and history would be made, but fate had other plans, disguised in a smirk and 6 careless words. The conference hall at the Zenith Tower gleamed with quiet intimidation. Gold-lined walls reflected the skyline. Bottled water imported from Iceland sat beside folders embossed with silver lettering. Every surface whispered wealth and exclusivity. Nia arrived early, not to impress anyone but to control the tempo. She believed the person who enters the room first defines the energy. It was her rule, and it had never failed her. Her team followed shortly after, sharp suits, calm faces, ready for the biggest negotiation of their careers. The other company's team trickled in soon after, all rehearsed politeness and calculated smiles. Everyone knew who Nia was. Some admired her. Others underestimated her. But they all knew she was the woman who made the impossible happen. All that was left was to meet the man on the other side. When Richard Hale finally entered, the energy shifted. He walked in like gravity owed him something, each step slow, deliberate, practiced. His cufflinks flashed as he moved. His voice filled the room before he even spoke. The kind of man who thought confidence and entitlement were the same thing. Nia rose from her seat, extending her hand. Her movement was calm, polished, professional courtesy in its purest form. He paused in front of her, looked at her hand as though it were an inconvenience, and smiled the kind of smile people use when they want to be cruel politely. "I don't shake hands with employees," he said. It wasn't the words, it was the intent behind them. They weren't meant to wound. They were meant to diminish. A flicker of unease rippled through the room. One assistant dropped his pen. Another looked down at his notes, pretending to read. Nia didn't flinch. She simply lowered her hand and said, "Then let's proceed." The room shifted again, but this time in her favor. What Richard didn't know was that Nia wasn't just the negotiator. She was the final authority. Her signature, or lack of it, would determine whether his company survived the next fiscal year. He just insulted the woman who held the fate of his empire in her pen. As the meeting began, he spoke over her, directing questions to her male colleague, pretending she was invisible. He smirked when he mentioned representation goals and diversity optics. Each word, dressed as corporate jargon, carried the same old poison, condescension disguised as charm. But Nia didn't fight him with words. She had learned long ago that silence unnerves men like Richard more than outrage ever could. Inside, she was still, focused, calculating. Her expression didn't betray what her mind was already setting in motion. She waited for the perfect moment, the kind of moment that ends. Careers without raising a voice. She reached for her phone under the table, her thumb moving with quiet purpose. A single message to her board. Pause all merger processes immediately. Hold until further notice. It was short. It was sharp. It was irreversible. She set her phone down, eyes steady, face unreadable. Richard continued talking, oblivious, overconfident, blind to the fact that the ground beneath him was already shifting. Nia nodded when appropriate, wrote a few notes, and smiled at the right times. To him, she looked agreeable. To everyone else, she looked composed. But in truth, she was rewriting the end of his story, and he hadn't even realized the first chapter of his downfall had already begun. The meeting dragged on for hours. Numbers filled the screens, voices rose and fell, and the sound of expensive pens scratching across paper echoed like whispers of deceit. Richard talked endlessly, confident, polished, and entirely unaware that his deal had already flatlined. He leaned back in his chair, feet almost touching the edge of the table. His smile, that of a man who believed every word he said was gospel. Every few minutes, he would say something that chipped away at the thin wall of professionalism in the room. Partnerships like this only work when we share the same image, he said once with a smirk. He looked around, pretending not to look directly at Nia, but everyone knew who his words were aimed at. We've made great strides in our diversity optics recently. You know, keeping up with the times. His team laughed lightly, not because it was funny, because they were scared not to. Nia's pen froze mid-note. She didn't look up, didn't respond. She just let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, the kind of silence that doesn't just hang, it exposes. She'd learned that the most powerful answer to disrespect isn't fury, it's poise. Her stillness said everything. You have no idea who you're talking to. One of Richard's aides shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Another stared at his phone like it held the key to escape. Even Nia's own team sat motionless, their loyalty written in their silence. They knew her. They knew that calm wasn't surrender. It was calculation. Inside, her thoughts were steady, surgical. Every insult, every glance, every word, all being quietly stored away for a moment he wouldn't see coming. Richard went on about vision alignment and brand synergy, completely unaware that while he was rehearsing his future, Nia was erasing it. When the meeting ended, applause filled the air, forced and shallow. Richard stood, shaking hands again, this time enthusiastically. He skipped Nia once more, as if to prove his earlier point. He didn't notice the brief, knowing look exchanged among her team. He left with laughter trailing behind him, the sound of a man celebrating too early. Nia gathered her notes neatly, thanked her staff, and walked out of the conference hall with the grace of someone who had already decided the outcome. Outside, the city blazed with sunlight. Traffic roared below the glass tower, horns mixing with the hum of ambition. Nia walked to the edge of the plaza, her heels clicking in rhythm with her heartbeat. Then she pulled out her phone and made the call that would shift everything. Status? The voice on the other end was brisk, her company's chairperson. Paused, she said evenly. Indefinitely, a pause. The kind that meant they knew there was more to the story. Explain, she did. Not with anger, not with dramatics. Just the facts, how he refused her handshake, called her staff, mocked diversity, and publicly undermined her authority. Her tone stayed calm, every word measured, precise. This isn't about pride, she said finally. It's about principle. If this is how he treats a partner before signing, imagine the arrogance once he has the contract. There was silence on the other end, the kind that weighed heavy with respect. Then, you have full authority. Do what you think is right. Nia exhaled slowly, steady as ever. Then the deal is off. And with that, a $10 billion merger, the one every analyst in the industry had been watching, ceased to exist. By late afternoon, the first tremors began. Emails flew. Calls piled up. Richard's office buzzed with confusion. He was in his penthouse suite at the Grand Plaza when the news came through. His chief financial officer stormed in, pale-faced. "They've pulled the deal," Richard laughed. "Impossible. We just wrapped the meeting." "Not anymore," the CFO said, sliding a phone across the desk. "Read it." The official statement had gone live. "Following a review of alignment and leadership values, our company will not be proceeding with the proposed merger." It was polite. It was clinical. But anyone who'd ever done business knew what those words meant. Reputation problem. Within minutes, phones began ringing nonstop. Investors, journalists, partners demanding explanations. And for the first time in years, Richard Hale didn't have one. By the end of the day, the story had escaped containment. At first, financial analysts speculated that the deal fell through due to market volatility. Then someone whispered to a reporter that there had been a personal altercation during the final meeting. By evening, the internet was buzzing. Insult sparks billion-dollar fallout. CEO refuses handshake with black executive. Values over valuation. Deal collapses amid scandal. Every headline was sharper than the last. Nia sat in her office, watching as the world pieced the story together without her saying a single word. She didn't need to defend herself. The truth had its own wings. She closed her laptop, leaned back in her chair, and let the chaos outside run its course. For once, silence was her loudest victory. But what she didn't expect was what came next. The messages, the calls, the stories from strangers who had seen her name trending, not as a negotiator, but as a symbol. People began to talk, really talk, about the quiet discrimination hidden in corporate halls. And as the headlines grew, something inside Nia shifted again. This wasn't just about one man's arrogance anymore. It was about every door she'd ever had to push open alone, and she was about to make sure the next generation wouldn't have to do it the same way. By the next morning, the story had caught fire. What began as whispers among financial circles turned into a global storm before sunrise. Every major news outlet ran it on their homepage. Handshake refusal costs $10 billion deal. The headlines were brutal, relentless, and they all pointed in one direction, at Richard Hale. He tried to control the narrative. A short statement went out from his office. The decision to withdraw was mutual and strategic. But the markets didn't buy it. Neither did the world. By mid-afternoon, his company's stock had dropped 9%, wiping out billions in valuation. Investors flooded his inbox with fury. His PR team begged him to stay silent. His lawyers warned that anything he said could worsen the damage. And for the first time, Richard Hale, the man who believed he could walk through any door without consequence, was speechless. Across the city, Nia Carter's phone buzzed nonstop. Some calls came from journalists wanting an interview. Others from business leaders offering congratulations or cautious distance. And then there were the messages, hundreds of them, from assistants, lawyers, analysts, and junior executives, mostly women, many black, writing to say they saw themselves in her. "I've been called articulate more times than I can count. They asked me to sit at the table, but never to speak. Watching what you did made me feel less crazy for wanting respect." Nia read each one in silence. She didn't respond, but she kept them. Each message was a piece of proof that what happened in that glass tower wasn't an isolated insult. It was a reflection of an entire system. She leaned back in her chair and whispered to herself, "It's never just one room. It's every room." Meanwhile, the fallout at Hale Dynamics turned from bad to catastrophic. Shareholders demanded an emergency meeting. A leaked memo revealed board members questioning Hale's leadership and his public insensitivity. The same executives who once laughed at his jokes were now whispering his downfall behind closed doors. He'd built his empire on image, and now That image was cracking like glass under pressure. A week later, during a live interview, a journalist asked him the question he'd been dodging. "Did you refuse to shake Miss Carter's hand?" Richard smiled stiffly, sweat glinting on his forehead. "I think that's been exaggerated," he said, but the damage was irreversible. Within hours, the clip went viral. The smirk he gave during that interview became a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power. Nia didn't celebrate. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she focused on what came next. In a quiet meeting with her company's board, she proposed something new, something no one expected. "I want to create a leadership initiative," she said. "A program that trains and funds young black women entering corporate negotiations. Not token mentoring, real power training. Deal strategy, resilience, and self-advocacy." Her board listened. Some nodded. Some hesitated. Then the chairperson spoke. "Do you want publicity for this?" "No," Nia said. "I want progress." Within a month, the Aurora initiative was born, a discreet but fully funded program partnered with 3 universities and 5 major corporations. Its purpose was simple: to make sure that the next Nia Carter didn't have to send a silent text under a table just to be respected. While the world kept dissecting the scandal, Nia moved quietly, deliberately, laying the foundation for something that would outlast every headline. But she couldn't escape the flood of attention completely. Some news outlets painted her as the woman who sank a billion-dollar deal. Others called her the negotiator of principles. Some praised her courage. Others accused her of overreacting. She ignored them all. What mattered wasn't how they labeled her. What mattered was what came after, the ripple effect in boardrooms she'd never even step into. Late one night, Nia sat alone in her apartment overlooking the city skyline. The lights below looked like rivers of gold, endless and cold. She thought about all the rooms she'd been in where people smiled through disrespect, where silence was mistaken for agreement. She remembered the administrative assistants who took notes while being overlooked, the managers whose ideas were claimed by louder voices, the interns who learned early to stay small to survive, and she knew this wasn't just about one insult. It was about dignity being treated like a luxury in places that called themselves professional. She closed her eyes and whispered again, "It's never just one room." Then she smiled, faint but steady. Not anymore. The following morning, an article appeared in the Financial Herald, "Leadership with Integrity: How One Woman's Refusal to Compromise Redefined Corporate Power." The piece wasn't authorized, but it got one thing right. It said, in a world obsessed with numbers, she reminded us that respect still has value. And for Nia Carter, that was enough. But this story wasn't done yet. The echo of her decision would soon spread further, beyond corporate walls, beyond business schools, into homes, communities, and conversations that had long avoided the topic of dignity and leadership. And when it did, the world would finally see what true power looks like when it doesn't need to announce itself. Weeks passed, but the shockwaves refused to fade. The story of the handshake that cost $10 billion had turned into something bigger, a public reckoning about power, respect, and who really gets to lead. In boardrooms across the country, executives began whispering her name. Some spoke it with admiration, others with discomfort. But they all spoke it. The question echoing through every meeting was the same. Would you risk billions for dignity? And the uncomfortable truth was that most of them wouldn't. Meanwhile, applications for the Aurora initiative flooded in. Young women from every corner of the world writing about the battles they fought in silence. One said she'd been told she was too confident for an intern. Another said her ideas were applauded only when repeated by someone else. A third simply wrote, "I want to learn how to walk into a room without apologizing for existing." Nia read every story, sometimes late at night, her desk lamp throwing long shadows across the pages. Each letter reminded her why she'd walked away from that deal, and why she'd never regret it. At the same time, Richard Hale's empire continued to crumble. Investigations were launched into his conduct, investors demanded leadership changes, And the company's image, once synonymous with innovation, became a cautionary tale taught in business schools. Within 3 months, he resigned. The official statement cited personal reasons. Everyone knew better. But Nia didn't celebrate his downfall. She didn't post. She didn't comment. She simply went back to work, guiding her team through new negotiations with her usual calm authority. When asked by a colleague if she ever felt vindicated, she smiled softly. "Vindication isn't the goal," she said. "Change is." By the end of that quarter, something unexpected began to happen. Companies started reevaluating their internal policies. Training programs on workplace equity tripled. Several CEOs, men and women alike, publicly stated that they were adopting values-first frameworks in major deal approvals. Analysts called it the Carter effect. She called it progress. Slow, imperfect, but real. And the irony? The same networks that once debated whether she'd overreacted were now inviting her to discuss ethical leadership on live panels. She declined most invitations, choosing substance over spectacle. But one message caught her attention, a letter from a university business professor. "Your decision has become a case study in my ethics class. My students debated whether integrity belongs in economics. One of them said, 'Maybe profit isn't the only form of growth.' Thank you for giving them something real to argue about." Nia read that twice and felt something shift inside. Not pride. Not relief, but quiet satisfaction. Months later, during the first Aurora Initiative graduation, 12 young women stood before her, each wearing the expression she once wore years ago, determination wrapped in restraint. They presented mock deals, defended strategies, challenged biases, and every single one of them did it without flinching. When it was over, one of them, a tall woman named Aurora, approached her. "I read about you before I even applied," she said. "That day in the tower, I kept wondering what it felt like to stay calm when someone tried to make you small." Nia smiled. "It felt like freedom, the kind that costs something but never loses value." Aurora nodded. "I want to learn that kind of freedom." "You already have," Nia replied. "You walked into this room knowing you belong." Outside the auditorium, cameras flashed. Reporters waited, hoping for a headline. One called out, "Miss Carter, do you think what happened last year changed anything?" She paused, then answered slowly, her words deliberate. "Change doesn't start with headlines. It starts in the quiet moments, when someone decides that self-respect isn't negotiable. That's how the world shifts, one choice at a time." The crowd fell silent for a beat before the questions resumed. But that single quote would appear everywhere the next day. That night, Nia returned to her apartment. The city outside was restless, sirens, neon, life refusing to sleep. She sat by the window, tea in hand, thinking about the chain reaction her silence had started. A man's arrogance had tried to reduce her, and instead had rewritten an industry. She didn't need applause or awards. The real reward was seeing the doors she'd once pushed open, finally staying open for others. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to exhale fully, not from exhaustion, but from peace. But her story wasn't finished yet, because every revolution, even the quiet ones, demands something more. A legacy that keeps moving long after the first voice fades. And Nia Carter, without realizing it, was just beginning to build hers. A full year had passed since the handshake that never happened. The world had moved on to new headlines, new scandals, new deals, but some stories refused to fade. They lived quietly in the background, shaping people's choices long after the noise died down. For Nia Carter, that year had been one of relentless motion, conferences, mentorships, private meetings, and countless unseen victories. She had become something she never set out to be, a symbol. Not of rebellion, but of restraint, proof that silence, when used with purpose, could echo louder than outrage ever could. One crisp morning, she stood before a room filled with industry leaders, the first global summit on ethical leadership, born from the ashes of a deal gone wrong. The event had been organized by companies that once swore morality and business couldn't mix. Now they were here, quoting her words, building panels around her decisions. When Nia stepped to the microphone, the room went silent. Every camera pointed at her. Every eye followed her movement. She began simply, "A year ago, I walked away from a table where I wasn't respected. People said I threw away $10 billion. Maybe I did. But I also walked away with something they couldn't buy, and clarity." The silence deepened. She continued, voice steady. "Clarity that success without self-respect is just decoration. Clarity that leadership is not about control, but courage. And clarity that every time we choose integrity, we teach the world what value really means." Applause rose slowly, not thunderous, but meaningful, the kind that comes from people who've been changed. After the speech, a young man approached her, an intern from one of the hosting firms. He was nervous, clutching a notebook. "Miss Carter," he said, "my father used to work under Richard Hale. He was laid off after the scandal. He struggled for a while, but he said watching what you did taught him that losing a job isn't the same as losing your worth." Nia smiled softly. "Tell him I'm glad he learned that. The world needs more people who know the difference." The intern nodded, eyes bright. "Do you ever regret it?" "Every now and then," she said honestly. "But then I remember how it felt that day, to keep my composure when he tried to take it from me." That feeling still stands taller than any number on a balance sheet. Outside the summit, reporters swarmed her again, but their questions were different now. Less about scandal, more about philosophy. "What advice would you give young professionals facing discrimination?" Nia answered without hesitation. "Remember this. Silence is not weakness when it's chosen with purpose. Sometimes the strongest statement isn't shouted, it's signed." The quote spread across media within hours, captioned over photos of her calm expression. Sometimes the strongest statement isn't shouted, it's signed. It became a mantra, printed on posters, quoted in speeches, etched on glass walls of university halls. Back at her office that evening, Nia stood by the window watching the skyline glow against the fading sun. Her assistant entered quietly. "The board approved the expansion," she said. "The Aurora initiative's going international. Europe, South Africa, Singapore." Nia turned, her smile small but certain. "Good. Let's make sure they never walk into a room thinking they have to shrink." The assistant hesitated. "Do you ever think he knows what he started?" Nia looked back at the skyline. "He knows," she said softly. "And that's enough." Later that night, she opened her inbox. Among the usual reports and memos, one subject line stood out. From Amara, Aurora graduate. The message was simple. "Today I signed my first contract as lead negotiator for a global firm. They tried to talk over me twice. I smiled, waited, and finished my sentence. I thought of you. Thank you for teaching me that dignity isn't loud, it's steady." Nia read it twice, then leaned back, feeling the quiet satisfaction that only comes from watching seeds grow where once there was concrete. She typed one short reply. "Keep walking tall. The room will adjust." In the months that followed, the echoes of her decision continued to ripple. Business magazines called it the Carter Standard. Executives debated it. Students studied it. And somewhere, someone facing their own moment of disrespect paused, remembered her story, and chose to stand tall instead of silent. That was her real legacy, not the scandal. Not the lost billions, but the chain reaction of courage she left behind. Years later, when asked in an interview what success meant to her, Nia Carter smiled and said, "Success is how you leave the room, not what you take from it. Some people leave with contracts, others with money. I choose to leave with my dignity. It lasts longer." She paused, looking straight into the camera. "And if I could go back to that day, the one where he refused my hand, I'd still extend it. Because respect doesn't lose its worth just because someone else can't afford it." The interviewer went silent. Viewers around the world did too. For a moment, everyone watching remembered what mattered, because dignity may not make headlines forever, but it never disappears. It lingers. It teaches. It changes the game quietly, one choice at a time, and as the screen faded to black, Nia's words remained, the same truth she had carried from that first moment in the conference hall. If respect isn't present at the table, the deal isn't worth signing.